So have you ever opened up World of Warcraft, logged onto your main looking to do some Mythic Plus dungeons? So you open up the group finder, queue up for 5 separate groups, and then 2 of those groups fill up, 1 of those groups delists, and the 2 other groups are people that are AFK, so they've invited nobody. So then you get a complete reset, you queue up for 5 more groups, and you don't get into any of those groups as well. So you continue doing this, trying to get into a group, but then you're 10 minutes down the road and you still haven't even gotten invited to a Mythic Plus group. And sometimes this just goes on, and all you're wanting to do is go run a Mythic Plus dungeon. I've definitely come across this issue many times, and I think a lot of other players have as well. And I think this is the biggest issue facing the Mythic Plus system in World of Warcraft, but I think there's a way that this can be fixed. And it's the fix that you may have been expecting, a solo queue Mythic Plus system. And I think the likelihood of getting a system like this has been growing over time, starting with Solo Shuffle, which is solo queue 3v3 arenas. Then it goes into Battleground Blitz, which was solo queue 8v8 rated battlegrounds. That system is being expanded upon in the War Within, where solo queue rated battlegrounds is going to be the main or only way you can partake in rated battlegrounds. And then we also have the substantial changes to dungeon difficulties that we got with Season 4 for Dragonflight. That's going to be the new normal going into the War Within. So there's many factors pushing this idea forward, but even though this is a straightforward system, I think there would need to be some pretty big changes to make this system work. Now there's only really one big change that would be needed for this system to work, and that would be a complete overhaul to Mythic Plus keys, or just a removal of Mythic Plus keys, because you can't really have a key system where one person has the key that they have to start the dungeon with if you're doing solo queue, because in a solo queue system, no one is actually the group leader. Nobody is choosing who comes along in that group. It's just 5 people who queued up, that were randomly put together, and then they go about doing their dungeon. You can't really have a keyed system with that. You may be able to overhaul the system and add in some progression type system, where as a player, you would need to progress through a system to keep increasing your key that would allow you to queue for higher tier dungeons, but all of that would just add a lot of needless complexity when you could just completely remove the keyed system and just allow people to solo queue for Mythic Plus dungeons, getting them in the actual dungeons, putting a lot more of their playtime in the actual dungeons instead of queuing up for dungeons and worrying about depleting keys. But that then begs the question, how would they go about implementing this system? Because there's a bunch of different ways they could do it. And I think I have a pretty simple yet effective way to implement solo queue Mythic dungeons. Now, all of this is going to be based off the assumption that keys are removed out of Mythic Plus dungeons, because as mentioned, that needs to happen for this system to actually work. And it would obviously be built off of the normal looking for dungeon system, where your tank, healer, or DPS, you queue up through the same window, a queue pops, you join in. Very simple. We already have that system. Everybody knows how that works. But once you add in all of the different Mythic Plus levels, you add a lot of complexity. And the first overarching piece is you would only be going from Mythic 2 to Mythic 10. And also keep in mind, with the dungeon changes, a plus 10 is what a plus 20 was for Season 3. And this is how the dungeon system is going to work going forward. So plus 10 is going to be the highest dungeon you need to do to get the highest item level of loot. Past plus 10, so plus 11 and onward, those groups would still be formed in the group finder. You would have to go into the group finder and look for different groups. And the reason that this would be the cutoff is that going past 10s, you're only doing that because you want to do it. You like the gameplay, you want to up your Mythic Plus score, you want to push higher keys. And another big factor of that being that going above 10s, you're gonna want to push as high as you can go, meaning dungeons are gonna get much more difficult. You're going to want to have control over what you're actually bringing with your group. You're going to want to be more optimized. You're going to want to be bringing more meta classes. You're going to want to be making sure you have as many group buffs as you can possibly get. And you're going to want specific specs or classes for specific dungeons. And I think it's completely fine that that element of the Mythic Plus system stays in the group finder. So you're left with a plus 2 to a plus 10 that you can solo queue for. But then we have to answer how these queues are actually going to work. And first off, being the requirements you need decide to actually queue for the system as a whole or different dungeons. And I would say you would probably have to have two different requirements. Some amount of item level, depending on what dungeon level you're trying to queue for, and some amount of mythic plus score. Now, I think both of these requirements should be pretty lax. You shouldn't need some crazy high item level. They could probably follow something pretty similar to LFR queuing or heroic dungeon queuing. You need some amount of item level to make sure you're in the realm of being geared enough, but it's not very strict at all. And this would be very similar for a mythic plus score. You wouldn't need to be super strict with it, but you want some amount of baseline as some form of protection to make sure that people are in the realm of requirements to be able to do this dungeon. Because I could definitely see situations where if they had zero protections, that someone is new to the game, they go buy like a mythic boost, and then they try to jump right into plus 20s because they have a high enough item level, and then they have no idea how to play. So if you had some baseline of mythic plus score as well, that could help protect against a lot of bad actors. So if you meet these requirements, you can queue. And I think there would need to be a couple different ways you could queue that would follow along with normal or heroic dungeon queuing. But you would also have to add another element of the mythic level you're trying to do. So let's say you're trying to do a +5. You would have two different ways to queue this. You would be able to queue up for any random dungeon at a +5 level. This would probably be the fastest for any different key level, or you would be able to go in and select any different dungeon you wanted to queue for a +5, exactly the way it works for normal or heroic dungeons. So if you didn't care what dungeon you got, you could just do random, or if you want to specify 3 different dungeons or only 1 different dungeon, you could do that as well, with the basic knowledge that if you only queue up for 1 dungeon, it's going to take longer than randomly queuing for any of them. And I would say that's probably the best way to go about it. You could potentially also add some system where you could queue for multiple key levels in one batch. So maybe there's like a +2 to +5 section, and you randomly queue for any dungeon in +2 or +5 or something like that. But with it being a solo queue system, I would lean more on the side of it being more simple and following normal and heroic dungeon queuing. So you meet all the requirements to queue up for a +5, you queue up for any random dungeon at a +5, you get a dungeon pop, everyone accepts, you're loaded into the front of the dungeon. And at this point, I would say there should be a minute or maybe a 2-minute timer before the dungeon starts. This will allow everybody to eat, to drink, to flask up, all that stuff, and then give you a little bit of time to discuss maybe the route you're going to be taking, or if someone wants to switch up a talent for some specific mechanic. You would want a minute or two to be able to do this, and a minute or two isn't going to be too big of a deal at the start of a dungeon. And then once that timer is up, the fog door goes away and you're into the dungeon. The timer starts and you start your dungeon run, and then you go about doing that Mythic Plus run in the exact same way you would have done it before. And just going off of everything we've discussed so far, I think this would probably be a better system than what we have right now for the majority of players. Now, there are some issues that can arise with a system like this, and I think the main one being queue times. Especially if you're a DPS, queue times can get pretty crazy. But I think with how popular Mythic Plus dungeons are, I don't think queue times are actually going to be as bad as people would originally think. And I think queue times would probably be more consistent than trying to join groups through the group finder. And what I mean by more consistent is depending on the time you're playing, you'll probably get queue pops in a similar amount of time. So if you compare that to just the group finder, sometimes you may get in a group instantly. Sometimes you may be sitting there for 30 minutes as a DPS trying to get into a group. But if you have a solo queue system, it'll probably be much more consistent than that, which I think is a pretty good thing. And I do think for a majority of players, it'll probably be much quicker in general, especially if they implement a few other safeguards. And I think one of the most helpful safeguards they could implement into this solo queue system would be to have the possibility of tanks or healers getting additional rewards for queuing as those roles. Because as you would expect, a tank or a healer is the main reason why queues aren't super quick in any solo queue system, whether it be LFR, normal dungeons, heroic dungeons, or even things like solo shuffle on the PvP side. Those roles are just played much less than DPS roles, and you only need one of each. So you have a massive pool of DPS and a much smaller pool of tanks and healers. But just adding the possibility of healers or tanks getting additional rewards would actually help quite a lot with this. And I think the main thing they could do is build this into the upgrade system. system. Let's say you're trying to queue for a Mythic Plus, but the queues are being held up because there's not a lot of healers or tanks on at the moment. They could again take something from the other solo queued system and give a priority queue type system for either of those roles to try to entice more people to play it. And tying this back into the upgrade system, I think the best thing they could do is just give those players more crests at the end of the dungeon for that priority queue. Let's say the system determines it needs tanks right now to speed up queues. Well, now tanks that queue at this time are just getting 25% increased crests after you complete the dungeon. This would be enticing enough for somebody to actually switch to that role or actually queue up in that role to get the additional rewards. It's something that doesn't negatively affect anybody. It's going to make queue times faster for everybody else, and it gives that person that decided to queue for that role because of the additional rewards something for speeding up the queues for everybody else. And crest is just such an easy way to do this because you're not actually giving like some additional reward. You're basically giving a time saver, because for the vast majority of World of Warcraft seasons, crests are capped. It's not until the end of the season where they go uncapped, and at that point, who really cares? But for the majority of the season, crests are capped. So all you're doing is allowing these players who are queuing as tanks or healers, speeding up the queue for everybody, making everybody's experience of trying to play Mythic Plus better. They're just getting a time saver of getting more crests more quickly. But there's also some pretty big upsides to a solo queue system for Mythic Plus. First off, being something we already touched on, queues are going to be much more consistent for the majority of players. If you meet the requirements, you can queue up for that dungeon. You're not going to have the possibility of sitting there for 30-40 minutes, spam queuing up for groups and not getting in any of it, which is definitely a possibility with the group finder system right now. Even if you're high enough item level with a decent Mythic Plus score, you could potentially just not get in a group, say as a DPS, for like 30 minutes, just because there's so many other DPS queuing for all those groups, and these other DPS may just be much higher item level to the point where they're much higher item level than you actually need to do that dungeon. So your experience queuing up for 30 or 40 minutes in the group finder is going to be horrible. So if you have a solo queue system that even if it takes a bit to queue up and get into a Mythic Plus, if it's much more consistent and generally quicker, it's just a better experience for pretty much everybody. And then you would have the upside of the meta problem, or a fix to the meta problem. Because I think everybody knows that when, say, a new season comes out and you're trying to do +5s or something, there's going to be someone starting a +5 group that's only going to invite the couple DPSs or the couple healers that are all the highest simming specs, and they won't invite anybody else that aren't playing those classes and those specs. And this issue is completely player driven, because if you're only able to queue for +2s to +10s, every combination of class and spec in the whole game can do 10s. No matter what the combination, if you have a tank healer and 3 DPS, any combination can do +10s on every dungeon of that season. Every single combination can do it. You are not going to have big issues if people are playing well, if people are geared enough to do all 10s with every combination. To actually complete 10s, you don't need a full stacked meta group with all group buffs you can possibly get. You simply just don't need to be that optimized, and a solo queue system removes all of that. You don't have any options to actually create the groups, so you can't meta chase a group with all of the flavor of the month classes. And you even have an extension of this, especially going into the War Within, based upon the different choices you're making in your talent trees or the hero talents in the War Within. Because there's definitely going to be a situation in the War Within where one of the hero talent choices is like 8% lower output than the other one, and someone's going to make a video on that fact, and then a ton of groups and a ton of people creating groups are going to inspect every single person that they invite, and if someone's playing that hero spec, they're going to remove them from the group because that hero spec does 8% less output than the other one, even though they're only doing a +5, and you could be 50% less effective than the top players and you would so easily be able to do the dungeon. And again, that's a player community driven issue that's completely removed from a solo queue system. And one last thing, I know some people will say that this is taking the MMO out of World of Warcraft even more. Players aren't going to talk. It's going to be like you're not even playing with anybody else and you're just taking one more of those elements away. But I really don't think that's the case. I don't think there's really any more or less socializing between solo queue systems and just looking for a group in the group finder. I just think solo queue systems, when done correctly and with a lot of the elements we went over in this video, would just be better for the vast majority of players without really losing much. You would also have the few minutes at the the start of the dungeon to socialize. You're not able to do anything else, so you may even see an increase in players socializing with each other while waiting for that dungeon to actually start. So in my opinion, implementing a system like this would just be better than the system we currently have. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.